The next speaker is Dr. Pavel Sorokin. He is an associate professor at the Institute of Education and Department of Sociology at National Research University Higher School of Economics in Russia. He is also academic supervisor of master program evidence-based educational policy and senior research fellow in the Institute of Education. He received a PhD in economic sociology in 2013 in the same institute with the support from a Russian presidential grant. He served as the chief analyst in the expert group for elaborating the strategy for development of education in Russia. And finally, he developed research, renovating theoretical and methodological tools of the current education research, as well as elaborating practical recommendations for transforming educational system basing on the expanded comprehension of human capital. Pavel, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, dear colleagues. It is an honor to speak in front of this audience, and I'm honored indeed to present a paper on how can education contribute to socio-economic development, rethinking human capital for the labor market of the future. This is a joint work together with Professor Isaac Fruman, the academic supervisor of Institute of Education in the High School of Economics, Russia. Well, the issues of contribution by higher education to socio-economic development have always been acute, especially in the last century, because it experienced vast transformations in political, social, cultural, and economic dimensions, of which higher education have been an essential part. And ironically, when things went wrong, like in late 60s with youth movements and political dissatisfaction across Europe, like in Paris, for instance, education was to blame. And when things went right, like regarding to technological advancement and economic growth in 60s and 70s, education was to be praised. However, the last decades we see negative dynamics in terms of economic growth on global level and in developed countries, maybe most of all. We also see that the perspectives for economic development are not very positive. Through our lifetime, we are not considered to see significant increase in the rate of economic growth according to OECD forecasts, which is especially painful in the context of demographical challenges as developed countries become increasingly old. So aging societies requires special instruments to increase economic growth in order to support those who becoming less capable of active participation in labor market. Aside of economic aspects, we have political institutions which are also under severe pressure. Only 40% of OECD citizens trust their governments. And what is maybe more important is that states are becoming more and more fragile in terms of they are perceived as less efficient and less legitimate. And the forecasts are also not very positive in this regard. So we have a huge problem with global socio-economic sustainable development, and education is obviously a sector which has to respond to this challenge. What do we see in terms of higher education development? Well, The obvious thing is that higher education systems are expanding rapidly. The red line here represents the number of countries with so-called universal systems of higher education. It means that more than 50% of population in the relevant age cohorts are enrolled in higher education institutions. And what is especially important is that if we take countries with highest coverage of higher education, we will not see that the coverage has stopped growing. So there is no ceiling that countries with the highest level of participation in higher education has already achieved. The investments in higher education also grow increasingly, even more than investments in primary and secondary education. The other side of this process is increasing cost of education, and the United States are the illustrative example of this issue. Through the last 2 decades, the cost of college in the United States increased more than 170%. It is the absolute record in terms of no other sector of US economy experienced that growth. Even healthcare system, which is obviously has to become more expensive in the context of aging society. However, education grows in its costs even higher than healthcare system. Overeducation is the thing that comes to mind when we compare expansion of education systems and decrease in economic growth. So in countries, in most developed countries like Japan, we can see that a large part of graduates go to job places not requiring actually higher education. So human capital is overqualified. But why do these extra skills not lead to creation of new high productive job places? Maybe it is time to stop expansion. Russia is especially illustrative in this regard. On this slide we can see that in terms of tertiary education, which includes higher education coverage, Russia is among the top countries in the world. However, if we take productivity in terms of GDP per capita, Russia is not in its best. We are approximately on the 40 or 50 place in the world. So a huge mismatch between being leaders in terms of formal coverage and being weak in terms of productivity of these employees with higher education diplomas. And on the right side of this slide, we can see the drastic statistics from Global Human Capital report by World Economic Forum. So Russia is on the 89th place according to the indicator availability of skilled workers, which is drawn from the surveys over employers in Russia. So a huge problem. But Russia is not the only one country having this problem. By the way, I forgot to say that even given this low productivity, Russian graduates with higher education diplomas enjoy quite high wage premium, which is the addition to earnings that a person has due to higher education diploma. It is approximately 50%. So if people go to labor market after school, they received 50% less than if they go to labor market receiving higher education diploma. And Russia is not the only country having this problem. Mexico, El Salvador, Venezuela, Bolivia, Jamaica, Peru, all of them had this inconsistency between high level of returns on higher education on individual level and weak dynamics of economic growth on aggregate national level. What is especially important and a bit novel is China, the major driver of global economy, seems to have the same issue. According to a recent paper, higher education expansion in China led to decrease in productivity by 2.5%. The logic is quite simple. The people with higher education diploma went to state sector, and state sector in China is less productive and less efficient compared with private sector. But if millions of new employees come to state sector, it requires financial flows to this sector. Therefore, by supporting state sector instead of private sector, China loses in terms of aggregate productivity. Well, the legitimacy of education is not only about economic growth, and therefore, even though there are some issues, for instance, in Russia, the leading headhunting agency has recently eliminated education from the necessary elements of vacancy description. In Turkey and Hungary, we have seen situations of direct policy movements against higher education in terms of decreasing enrollments. However, legitimacy of higher education remains because state requires higher education to promote its legitimacy, and families demand higher education because it is seen as a route to social mobility, not limited to understanding of the current needs of labor market, but seeing more strategically. Families invest in their children's education not because they see the direct demand on the labor market, but because they believe that it will enhance the strategic perspectives of their children. So the leading theory, the leading academic approach to tackle the problem of contribution by higher education to economic development is human capital theory. It has two major points. One of them is that more qualified worker would be more productive compared to less qualified employee. Another thing is that higher education contributes, and education in general, contributes to the whole innovative capacity of the economy. So people may develop new technologies, find new knowledge, disseminate it, and that also contributes to economic growth. This slide is our attempt to summarize the developments of human capital theory through the recent 5 decades. So on the left side and on the central of this slide, we see those elements of human capital that are most elaborated, that education systems have been most focused on developing. And in the center it is basic cognitive skills, which refer to abilities to use logics and to operate correctly with the given knowledge. It also implies literacy, numeracy skills, so all the things that we usually think that schools are responsible for. And projects like PISA is aimed at monitoring the development of these basic cognitive skills, and it is seen in literature as traditional general human capital. It is general because it is applicable to almost any type of job place. So in any job place you need to learn to you need to be able to communicate, you need to be able to conduct some simple calculation, etc. On the left side is something that has been in the center of higher education systems development in the last 50 years. It is traditional specific human capital referring to specific cognitive skills and professional skills. And it is precisely the type of human capital that is usually in literature referred to as the source, the major component that led to growth of economy in developed countries in after World War II period. So the best illustration would be engineering. So if you are a good engineer, of course you need to have some basic cognitive skills. You need to know how to calculate. But also you will need to have some more complex cognitive skills. You need to operate some complex equipment, and it refers to some narrow professional skills. However, this is not the whole human capital story. On the right, we see new types of general human capital that have not been yet given necessary attention by higher education systems development. And these types include non-cognitive skills or personal traits developed. This idea was developed and put forward by James Heckman, who received Nobel Prize. Another thing is universal competences, which is about the discourse relating to direct address to employers about what do they need. And all this talk about 4K competencies like communicating, cooperating, transversal skills, these new literacy stories including digital literacy, including financial literacy. All these things are more or less under umbrella of universal competences type of human capital. And the third one is allocative or entrepreneurial element of human capital. I will talk about it a bit later because it is something that educational systems have been paying the least level of attention in the recent decades. Okay. Well, traditional cognitive skills are important for economic growth, and World Bank has demonstrated that both PISA scores relate to aggregate economic growth, and also that higher education is the best type of investments in the case in terms that it gives 9% rate of return. So the traditional specific human capital has been really productive in terms of its contribution to economic growth, in terms of its individual rate of return as well. Because if you have money, it is better to invest them in higher education, because 9% are quite a good result. It is bigger than you would get if you invest in financial assets, in other kind of assets that you can find in the market. However, the thing is that the explanatory power of this traditional cognitive element of human capital for growth decreases from over 35% to less than 20%. Why did it happen? We believe that it has to deal with changing demands from the labor market, and I will illustrate it a bit later. Non-cognitive skills is something that has very well foundation in academic literature, something that is often referred to Big Five framework. So it has been shown that, for instance, in American labor market, the explanatory power of IQ tests over individual earnings is not more than 7%, so almost nothing. If you take other elements, other indicators in traditional cognitive-oriented achievement tests, you will see that the explanatory power is about 17%, which is also not quite a lot. But if you take non-cognitive skills or personal traits, you will see that it explains more of individual success in the labor market. Why personal traits are called skills in this framework? Because they are trainable. We can help people to become more conscious, to become more open to the new experience, to become more sustainable, more persistent, etc. So there is huge research on this thing, but there is lack of practices in education, at least a lack of nationwide experiments in terms of promoting non-cognitive skills and personal traits as an essential element of human capital, which becomes especially important in the service economy, when a person has to be client-oriented. It requires not only being cognitively strong, but also to have personal traits, to be nice for your client, for instance. And these are the analytics of US labor market dynamics in terms of the nature of tasks that employees have to perform. And we see that routine cognitive skills, the green line, is decreasing steadily. So that is maybe a part of the answer to the question why cognitive indicators of human capital become less important for explaining growth on aggregate level and on individual level. On the other side, non-routine analytical and interpersonal skills, interpersonal types of tasks are increasing. And of course, it requires different types of skills, different types of characteristics of human capital. The same thing can be observed in European context. Well, now the third the third element of the general human capital, which is novel in a way to higher education because it has not yet paid much attention to it, is entrepreneurial element of human capital. Ironically, from the 70s, it has been argued and written and published in literature that entrepreneurial abilities are not equally distributed among the population. They are not automatically performed. It means that if labor market is changing, it is wrong to assume that people with skills that can be allocated to the new niche on the market will automatically indicate this niche and flow to this direction. No, somebody will not. So the entrepreneurial abilities are not automatically performed. It has been shown by Theodor Schultz, who also received Nobel Prize, that formal education and especially higher education diploma somehow relates to these allocative abilities. However, we must keep in mind that we're talking about 1960s and 70s, a period of the unprecedented level of economic growth basing on existing institutions. So in 70s, it was maybe less difficult to become successful in economy than now, because in 70s we saw something about 7% of annual economic growth in developed countries, and nowadays it is less than 3%. However, the crucial idea about allocative ability as a special element of human capital distinct from other elements is that these allocative abilities empower human capital to participate in institutional transformations. And given that we have weak level of economic growth, both on the national level and on the global level, maybe something is not quite all right with our major economic institutions. Maybe they should be changed. And this is a theoretical schema that offers a framework for thinking about how human capital, how people can change institutions via entrepreneurial element of their human capital. And this is a slide again basing on United States, showing that by 2027 the majority of labor force in the United States will be freelancers. And what does it mean to be a freelancer? It means that you have to plan your time on your own. You need to find clients, to find partners, to build networking on your own. There is no manager, there is no human resource department which will care about your training. You need to invest in your training by yourself, and it is a very difficult situation which will be facing the increasing part of population in the coming years, not only in the United States but also globally, because the other side of institutional transformation is increasing informality. And even upper middle income countries experience increase in informal economy. For instance, in Russia, in the middle 90s, 80% of labor force were employed in formal corporate sector. It means that they worked in the framework of professional skills and specific human capital in its most traditional understanding. Nowadays, less than 40% of Russian labor force are in formal corporate sector. So this reality that is coming to United States is also coming to Russia. So what we can see, that of course it is wrong to assume that the specific human capital and traditional human capital in its traditional understanding becomes less relevant. Okay, in 60s we needed more of engineers. Nowadays, information technologies and programists are becoming in high demand on the labor market. And it is obviously a specific human capital requiring higher order cognitive skills, and we need these employees to fill our labor market and to increase growth. But not everybody can be a programmer, and it is not expected by labor market, by employers, that everybody will become an employer and a programmer. So, summarizing, what are the conclusions about contribution by higher education to socio-economic development? Well, the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that human capital theory developments have been largely neglected by educational policy in practice, despite elaborations by Heckman, by Schultz, by OECD, and by others. Universities remain oriented in practice on traditional, professional, specific human capital, and it is not quite enough. Importantly, traditional cognitive skills need to be addressed in lifelong learning. It means that universities maybe have to take part in training of populations in terms of general cognitive skills. Non-cognitive skills and personal trait, they are always relevant. I recall talk with Martin Conroy, who is one of most acknowledged economists of education. And he said that, you know, you always require a skill to sell something to somebody if you're working in the market. So essentially, non-cognitive skills have been, and personal traits have been first measured and found to be important back in 30s or 40s, and they remain no less important today. And what can be the tools to increase these kind of skills? Well, the review that Heckman and colleagues made in the United States showed that you need to focus on real-life problems. You need to make education more practice-oriented in order to develop these personal traits. However, it does not always work. And in some cases, the experiments in the United States had negative results. So you create special environment for developing personal traits, and it turns out that people come out of this intervention with worse results than they came in. So we need new research and dissemination of practices and search of new instruments in terms of developing non-cognitive skills, keeping in mind that they will be relevant regardless of what are the specific demand from the labor market, until we are living in the capitalist economy. Well, universal skills, the first thing is to have a clarification concerning theoretical framework. It is still very, sexy in terms of different employers and different policymakers figure out new lists of universal competences, of core skills, etc. But there is no comprehensive framework to finding how do all these skills relate to each other. For instance, how do new literacy skills relate to 4K skills, like for communicating, cooperating, creativity, and critical thinking. But however, there are still some examples of successful intervention in this regard, in regard of universal skills. And the fourth element, allocative abilities, entrepreneurial element of human capital, is most underdeveloped. And our meta-analysis of literature on entrepreneurial education showed that it is one of most heavily criticized direction of education practice. So universities are really not that successful in terms of preparing for entrepreneurial career. And of course, corporate entrepreneurship also is important. So the reality of labor market implies that even corporate employee has to become entrepreneurial in a way that he will need to elaborate new projects, new ideas, to enter new teams, to do networking, and all this requires the activity, the proactive position in terms of your environment, which relates to entrepreneurial element of human capital according to Theodor Schultz's theory. So I would like to conclude with this, and I hope that Bologna process and the universities' integration and cooperation will somehow advance the contribution by higher education systems to the challenges that we're facing and will be facing in the coming decades. It is very essential. Thank you very much.